On nights when the wind came down from the utter north, it made the wall sing, a long thin hum that gathered itself in the ice and shivered through stone and timber, so soft a sound a man might think it born of his own bones. Jon learned the song from boyhood, first as a bastard pressed against the battlements of Winterfell, then as a brother with black on his back, then as Lord Commander with more weight than any cloak could hold. He learned that the wall had many voices, the creak of ancient timber braces shifting as the cold tightened its grip, the whisper of blown snow sent skittering along the walkway, the sudden sharp crack like a musket snap when a fisher leapt another finger's breadth through blue-white ice. He learned the taste of the air up there, clean and metallic, and the feel of the rime gathering in his beard like old age. He learned, too, that the world could be empty enough to make a man's blood loud in his ears. That night he stood alone save for Ghost. The dire wolf moved like a patch of moonlight fallen into snow, silent and certain. The wind tugged leanly at Jon's cloak and darted fingers under his gorget, as if to prise him open and stare at the red inside. Far off, where the world bent, the sky wore a green bruise. A faint rippling veil stirred there, and now and again a pale spear climbed and died, but otherwise the night was iron dark and clean. Castle Black lay beneath him, a scatter of warm orange eyes, and beyond, the King's Road ran south as a faint suggestion carved through drifts, black and white twisting together like threads in a rope. North, the land fell away into the haunted fastness that men had taken to naming only with dread, as if to name it plain would call it closer. The wall had his back, the north had his face. Between them he existed, a hinge in the cold. Ghost's ears pricked. Jon felt it as much as saw it, the keen alertness that ran through the wolf like a stretched wire suddenly plucked. He laid gloved fingers to the thick fur at Ghost's neck and crouched, breathing into the wolf's breath so the scents gathered on the air would be shared between them. The wolf's nose lifted, whiskers sifting the wind. His body leaned, not toward the forest, not toward the sky, but toward the ice itself beneath their feet. "What is it?" Jon whispered without knowing why he lowered his voice. The wall did not mind speech, but men whispered in cathedrals under stone and ice alike. Ghost's answer was a low sound in his chest, not fear and not threat either, nearer to a question. He stepped to the parapet and looked down. The drop was clean and dizzying, a sheer blue face plunging into blackness where the shadow pooled. Snow blew away like the skirts of a ghost, hiding and showing the ledges where rime had gathered into odd sculptures. The sensation came again, crawling up from the ice through Jon's boot soles, a small tremor or thrumming, too steady for a crack, too regular for wind. He thought of a distant drum, no, of breathing held behind glass. He stood and set his palm against the crenel's ice. Cold bit him through the glove. It sang up his bones to his elbow, a fine needle of cold that should have been pure but instead was troubled by a murmur. It was like laying a hand to the flank of a great horse in the dark and feeling the rib cage rise and fall. A fancy, he told himself, but when Ghost lifted a paw and set it on the same ice, the wolf's claws clicked and he kept his weight there and would not look away. "Come," Jon said. "If there's a fault, I'd best see it." He was not alone long after that. The wall, like a lord, required its attendants to be done just so. An hour before midnight, the relief came up the stairs with their torches streaming smoke. Dolorous Ed was among them, with a face that looked as if he'd been born into his own wake. He slouched toward Jon with the movement of a man who owed sleep a debt. "If the wind gets any brisker, it'll sand us down smooth," Ed said, "like pebbles in a stream. I'll be a nice round stone when spring comes, if spring remembers the way." Jon nodded toward the parapet. "Put your hand here," he said. "I'd rather not," Ed said, but he did, the torch in his other hand staining his face orange. He made a sound small as a mouse. "Well, that's a queer thing," he said. "Feels like something turned over far under a blanket. I had a cat once. You could tell it was alive by the purr, though my mother called that noise wicked. She said nothing that took joy in mice could be holy." Jon straightened. Was there any blasting done along the face today? Any work that might carry? Only Leathers scolding the Slope boys for goading 1-1. Carries when he scolds. The giant, Leathers you have to lean into to catch a word. Ed tilted his head. You think it's a fault? I can fetch iron Emmet. Do, John said, and send for the builder's master. Quietly, Ed. Quietly is my way, Ed said. When I laugh at a jape, men think it's a snowflake landing. When I cheer for a victory, men think a mouse sneezed. They went down from the wind's hands into stairwells where the air was dead and close. Then across the yard to where smoke laid itself along rafters and men warmed themselves in the lee of walls. The hall's doors were ajar for a pair of men bringing out barrels. Warmth and talk spilled through the gap like gravy. John did not want to be pressed with voices and faces. He turned instead toward the long, low building of the builders. The builder's master was an old man called Yarwolf by some because no one could say exactly how many winters he had outlived. He came out bundled in a cloak that might have once been black before the sun had bleached it to ash. He had hands like hooked roots and eyes that went pale when they took in light and went dark when they thought. An odd hum, my lord, he said when he had listened at the parapet and laid his cheek to it and rapped the ice with his knuckles. But not a fault. No sap running.
No sap.
The cold is firm as church. You see how clear the ice is here? Where it goes to blue like milk, that's where the melt and freeze have argued. Here it's hard and glassy. That hum is a stranger. I've only heard like it once, when I was young enough to fight the stairs. When was that? The year the king beyond the wall came with the fires in the woods and the dead in the drifts, Yarwolf said. The old bear sent me up to check the winch. It was a night near as cold as this. It seemed something far below had turned over in its sleep. He smiled a small, sly smile into his beard. But I'm a builder. If something turns, it's earth or ice. There's nothing dug into the wall here? No old chapels, no chambers. Not here, Yarwolf said. The wall gives back what you dig from it unless you bind the hole with something older than iron. The old tunnels under the night fort hold because the old gods keep their hands on them. But Castle Black was always the lean one, built modest and mended more than most. The wall is honest here. Honest, Ed said. If it starts telling jokes, wake me. When they went down again, John did not go to his chamber. He cut around the yard, past the rookery where the ravens were murmuring in their sleep, a low communal rumble like the sea under ice. The rookery had its own smell, of droppings and warm, dusty feathers and straw that had gone sour. A single bird, pale-eyed and watchful, turned its head and fixed him as he passed. John thought of Maester Eamon's hands when he touched the birds, frail hands, but sure, as if the bones in them remembered a world without tremor. He had intended to visit the Maester tomorrow, for counsel on a matter that was not, so he told himself, too heavy to bear without it. But the weight had shifted, and the wind had shifted with it. He found his feet pointing him another way, toward the east gate and the campfires that hunkered in the lee of the wall where King Stannis Baratheon's men had settled like winter crows. There were fewer fires now, and tighter knots of men around each. Provisions were thin, the king's displeasure thinner. John kept his hood up and his cloak's hem out of the mud and let the smell of wood smoke and horse piss and boiled leather fill him. Men watched him as he went by, some with weary courtesy, some with open dislike, and a few with sharp interest that made the hairs rise at the nape of his neck. Lawloress red was a thread through the camp, a banner's corner here, a cloth there. Even in the darkness, the red priestess caught the eye. She did not move like any northerner John had known. She flowed, and the cold seemed to make way for her. Melisandre stood between two fires and looked into one as if it held a lover's face. When she turned at his approach, he had the old foolish thought that heat lived under her skin like candlelight. "My Lord Commander," she said, inclining the red tower of her hair, "the night is most sharp. Even shadows cut tonight. Your wolf's shadow is the largest of all." "Shadows don't cut," John said, choosing bluntness because he did not like the way she smiled. "They lie. They show," she said. "But men's eyes are not fit for the showing." She gestured with two fingers toward the wall. "Something moves in that old cold. Something that remembers fire." He kept his face clean of surprise. "You feel it too." "I do not feel," she said, amused. I see. In the flames I saw pale scales rippled with breath, and a hand that did not know itself, and a gate of living with smiling a mouth it had no right to wear. The fire kissed my eyes with your name. And what did it tell you to do with my name? Keep it, she said. You will have the chance to forget it, and then to choose it, and then to break it. That is a long way. Tonight is only the first move. The old gods turn in their sleep as if a child has stepped on the bed. The red gem at her throat seemed to pulse of its own accord when she laughed. I am fond of children's mischief when it sets the board my way. I care little for boards, John said, and less for being anyone's peace. He looked past her. A man with long face and narrow eyes stood in the shadow of a smithy awning. He ducked his head when John's gaze found him. If you have counsel for the wall, give it to me plainly. Otherwise, I'll bid you good night. What moves in the ice is not for your king, she said, nor for mine. What moves there will ask a price when it wakes. Better to set a price of your own. Bring with you wood and words. Bring the one who calls himself Tormund of the many wives. Bring a child of the singing wood if you have one. And bring your dead. Her smile went softer, at odds with the cruel line of her mouth. I have a taste for dead men who refuse to be wise. He could not keep the glance toward the rookery's tower from his face then. It flashed quick as a knife. She caught it and tucked it somewhere, as a maid tucks a favor into her belt. You speak of things that will get men killed, John said. Men are winter's tinder, she said gently. Do not waste heat. He left her with her eyes in the fire and her laughter a wingbeat between the flames. Ed fell into step on his left as if the earth drew him that way by habit. I like her least when she is smiling, Ed said. When she isn't smiling, I could almost forget how warm she is. It seems indecent, being warm like that. John did not answer. He had the wolf's restlessness under his ribs. He felt caged as he crossed the yard. Once in his chamber, he lit no candle. He did not want to set the walls to leaping and make his thoughts leap with them. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed and unlaced his boots in the dark, ghost's breath filling the room, steady and certain. He found sleep as one finds a snagged thread. He tugged until the knots gave, and then he went down and down into something that felt like water but was not. He dreamed of Winterfell's crypts, of stone men lying in a stone dark, with their swords on their laps and dust that tasted of long memory gathering in his mouth. His steps made no sound there. He knew the turnings as one knows a childhood scar by touch, and he did not need light to find the last end where the air was tightest. When he put his hand to the door there, it whispered across the floor and let him in as if he were expected. Inside was a cradle the height of a man's knee. The cradle was hewn from a single block of black stone, the same that made the oldest steps that went down to the hot springs. He put his hand into the cradle and his fingers met warmth. 3 shapes nestled there like sleeping birds. He laid his palm on one and felt the throb of a slow old heart that was not his. Above him something moved. He looked up and saw the ceiling was roots. White roots, smooth and wet, netted and braided into a lid, and woven among them were little sparrows of light like blown embers. The embers woke one by one when he breathed. He thought not in words, wake. He woke with a hand on his sword hilt and his heart hitting at the inside of his ribs like a trapped bird. The room was black. Ghost had lifted his head. John could not see the wolf's eyes, but he could feel them on him in the dark. They were an acknowledgement between them, not a comfort. Somewhere outside, a raven gave a single questioning croak. He waited for the foolish shape of fear to drain away. It did not, but it settled like cream. When Gray finally threaded the shutters, he rose and went to the rookery, where the night was not yet done but the birds had begun to fidget and complain. Maester Eamon slept in a chair by the brazier with his hands folded like the old carving of a saint. It hurt John always to see how small the maester had become, and it kindled something fierce in him to be gentle in the old man's presence, as if the gentleness itself were a blade he could hold between the world and this fragile thing. I did not mean to wake you, John said when Eamon's eyes opened. You did not, Eamon said and smiled. But the birds did. They considered dawn an obligation. "What brings you at a thin hour, Lord Snow?" Jon told him about the hum in the ice. He did not tell him about Melisandre's eyes or the dream or the warm nest. He was a man grown and he could keep his own counsel. He did mention Ghost's intent gaze on the ice and the feeling through the stone like breathing. Eamon's blind eyes went half-lidded as if to see a thing more clearly. "There is an old notion," he said, "that ice is not dead but sleeping water. Men say a lake goes to sleep when it freezes. They do not mean what they say, but words remember themselves. The wall is a sort of sleeping with watching bound into it. Old binding, older than kings. It may be that you've come near to a knot in that binding. A knot that can be untied? A knot that might look back if you tug at it. A breath of a laugh. As a boy, I would have given a cup of my blood to see the bindings of this world. As an old man, I think I gave too much blood to see them and learned to wish otherwise. It is a great thing, wanting to know. It is a terrible thing, wanting to know when the answer is teeth." He reached out and touched Jon's sleeve as lightly as snow. "You should go to the Night Fort." "The Night Fort?" Jon had not spoken the word, but perhaps he had carried it on his back like a little child, and the maester had felt the weight. "Why? The oldest places in the world are not always where a man expects. The wall has been mended and mended and mended. But the Night Fort was raised when the mortar was wet, and the old gods still have their thumbs in the corners. They will not speak to me. They never did. But you—" He tilted his head, listening to a thing Jon could not hear. "You have a way of opening doors that are not doors." Jon meant a meaningless protest, something about how his way was to put his shoulder to what needed doing, and no more, but the words would not line up in his mouth. Instead, he nodded. "I'll take a small party," he said. "Sledge, tools, lamp, oil." "Take the wildling," Eamon said. "He laughs too much for a haunted place, and ghosts do not like to have their silence broken. Take the man with the silly face and the solemn mouth. He does not know it, but he is kinder than a winter pasture." Jon knew he meant Ed. "And take a boy. The old places look differently at boys." Jon left the maester to his birds and the rising day with a feeling he had carried something in and was taking something else out. In the yard, men were blowing on their hands and sharing a bowl of something that steamed. Tormund Giantsbane found him as if he kept a bell tied to Jon's cloak. "Well, if it isn't the little Crow King," Tormund boomed, throwing his arms wide. Frost caught in his beard like pearls. "You look like a man coming from his woman after a short night and a long argument." "Was she pretty?" "The argument?" "I'm going to the Night Fort," Jon said. "I want you with me." Tormund's face changed from a grin to something more thoughtful, like a stag lifting its head from browsing. "Ah," he said, and reached into his beard as if he kept a pipe there. He did not bring out a pipe. "You've heard the singing. You call it singing?" "The ice does not know the words," Tormund said, "but the earth does. The Night Fort has more old songs in it than any hall I've ever been too drunk to be cast out of. There was a sound last night brought me awake out of a warm fart sleep, and I lay there grinning like a fool thinking of the tales my grandmother told. She said there was a belly under the wall. She said if you pressed your ear to the old stones and listened quiet, you would hear the old little folk still chewing." "Chewing what?" "Chewing what they chewed," Tormund said. "Roots, rock, dreams, men's oaths. All good for you if you can stomach them. Oh, do not look so sour. I'll come. A haunted kitchen is a kitchen all the same. Maybe we'll find a stew pot nobody's thought to stir in 1,000 years." They set out before midday, when pale sun turned the world tin and the air bit rather than gnawed. Jon took Ed and Leathers and Iron Emmett. In the middle of the kitchen was a well. It seemed to drink light. When Jon peered down, the circle remained dark, and the smell that came up was not waters but a cold gone stale from keeping to itself. Tormund thumped the well's lip with the flat of his hand. "A deep throat," he said, approving. "I've known a few." "You'll not stick your head in this one," Ed said, looking ill-used by life. "If you do, something coming up will consider it a savory plug." Jon went to one knee and set his palm on the well's rim. The cold there was different. The stone wore it like old skin rather than like a skinning knife. He felt that hum again, fainter but purer. Ghost stood with his front paws on the stone and listened with his teeth slightly bared as if tasting the air. "Ropes," John said. "Lanterns. I'll go first." "That would be very like a Lord Commander," Ed said, gathering the coil. "Just because it's fool's work does not mean a lord ought not do it." Leathers went, because Leathers was a man who had the measure of silence and what could hide in it. He slid down first, boots on stone, lamp carefully lowered, the flame making a little trembling bell around him. Then came John, with the weight of the rope a new thing around his ribs, and the well's throat a circle of diminishing day above, and the world contracting to stone where water had long ago made a smooth path for itself. The smell went stranger as they went. It was old and damp, but it was also, John could not name it. There was a whiff of something like struck flint, and something like smothered coals, and something faintly sweet that made the back of his tongue ache. The well ended not in water but in a tunnel cut through stone. The floor was slick. Their lanterns threw a wavering yellow that found arches and a low ceiling braided with roots. The roots were pale as bone. He touched one and felt a coolness that was not the cave's. It felt like touching a wound's skin. He took his hand away. "The children's work," Tormund said behind him. He had come down the rope like a bear backs down a tree. One's head was a black circle above, peering, making a surprised groan like a door that had not meant to open. They kept this place as a hen keeps her nest, for their gods, for their secrets. "The Black Gate is this way," John said. He knew the tunnel like a man knows the line of a scar. He and Samwell Tarly had crept here what felt like an age ago now. They passed it. A living face in wood, eyes shut, mouth shut, old and dreaming in the curve of a white trunk that had grown up inside the stone. When John put his hand near it, he felt a cool exhale. He did not wake it. He went by. Beyond the gate the air changed, the tunnel broadening, then narrowing, then running under the wall itself and the roots growing thicker where they crossed, like veins in a man's wrist, and then a chamber opened before them that John did not remember. It should not have been there, but it was, a round place with a ceiling lost in shadow and a floor that sank gently toward the middle. Their lanterns reached only a skin of the place. At the center lay something that the light did not want to touch. They came down toward it, and the hum that had whispered through the ice grew clearer. The sound was not in the air. It was in their bones. John felt his teeth itch. There was a smell here, new and old at once. A smell like a struck spark in a cold hearth, an echo of fat turned to smoke, the needle-prick sweetness of sap. Leathers lifted the lamp and the light slid off the object as if off old oil. It was a nest, not of twigs and grass. It had been made from plates of black stone, fitted cunning as scales, each the size of a man's palm, set into a shallow bowl sunk into the floor. The stone was obsidian, dragonglass, and some half-forgotten part of John thought that was wrong and right both, for dragonglass drank light the way the wall drank sound. Between the plates something had dried and cracked and turned the color of old parchment. Sap? He leaned closer. It did not look like sap. It looked like resin, but it smelled like pitch and apples and a little like blood. Dentro that dark bowl lay 3 shapes. They were eggs. John knew it before his mind finished the thought. He had seen dragon eggs. Every boy had in the stories, hard as stone and patterned like scales. And he had seen the carved ones maesters kept locked in cabinets when he was a child trailing after Robb and Bran. And he had seen the hatchlings in Maester Luwin's copperplate in a book that had smelled of vinegar and leather. But he had never seen living stone that made the air around it lean closer. One egg was the color of ash with veins of palest blue fired through it in a net as if frost had set in molten glass. Another was deep green, moss and shadow, with flecks that caught the light and spat it back. Not gold, but the metal color of dawn. The third was something no simple word could hold, iron and pearl, smoke and milk, a gray that moved when the lamp did like sealskin in water. Ghost stood absolutely still. The hair along his spine lifted as if a new wind had come into the chamber and met him there with its hands out. John knelt. He reached into the bowl. The cold in the air made his breath visible, but when he laid his palm on the nearest egg a warmth answered his hand. not hot as a kettle nor even as strong as a man's body, but steady, a held-in heat like a hearth banked for night. His palm knew the shape like a thing forgotten and found. The pattern of its scales met the pattern of his skin and made a fit. He did not know how long he knelt like that. He heard leathers breathe. He heard the slight impatient noise Ed made whenever a man told himself a thing was not strange. He heard the tiny tapping sound of melted drip finding some old metal ring. Under it the hum went on, and now he could hear what it was like. It was like a cat at ease. It was like a coil warming in an ash bed. It was like a heart. Tormund squatted and scratched his beard until frost fell out of it. "Well, well," he said softly, "the little folks' hens laid big. Or a queen came here and left her keepsakes. Or the world is full of eggs if only a fool learns where to look." Ed put his hand to his mouth as if he had a laugh he needed to keep alive behind it. "Dragons," he said in his flat tone. "Well, I am relieved. It is never anything useful like a cask of summer wine." Iron Emmett's face was hard to read. His jaw had a set to it that could have belonged to a man staring down a storm. "We should cover this," he said. "We should wall this chamber up and forget it." Leathers only shook his head slowly like a man watching a boy walk toward a fire and decide he likes the smell. Jon lifted his hand off the egg. His palm tingled. The whole of him seemed to have been tuned to a new note. His heartbeat had found another drummer. He drew breath carefully as if any sudden motion might wake more than the echoes. "We'll not forget," he said. "This is ours. The Watch's, not the King's." "The King will count it otherwise," Tormund said. "Kings count all the coins, even the ones with beasts' faces nobody can spend." "Let him count," Jon said, and thought, "The Red Woman will have seen this." He set his hand to the ash-blue egg again and felt the warmth respond with a faint deepening, as if the egg recognized his weight. "We'll take them up, slowly, carefully. If you hand a man a torch in a dry barn and tell him to walk carefully, he will walk carefully," Ed said. "And then something in the straw will leap up laughing." They fashioned a cradle of ropes and slings, and laid a sledge across the bowl and levered the first egg up with 3 men's care and a 4th man's breath held to count the seconds. Ghost watched without blinking. When the egg moved fully free of its bed, the hum changed. Jon felt it. They all felt it. They looked at one another, each seeing the same question on each other's mouths. He did not know if the egg had sighed, or the nest had, or if the wall itself had stirred where this was settled deep in it. They brought the first egg up through the tunnel under the weirwood's face. Jon looked at the living mouth without meaning to. Its lids were shut still, but the white wood gleamed faintly as if thin moonlight lived inside it. He thought of a thought tucked into a mind not his, waiting there for a moment when the hand reached again for the cradle. The ascent through the well took time and fed on patience. When Jon finally clambered out into the kitchen again, blinking at the day's pallor as if it were bright, the open space felt indecent. Men had very small hands, and the sky was very large for them, and it seemed wrong to be carrying a thing that had waited so long under the stone. He laid the egg in straw in the sledge's bed and had men wrap it in furs like a swaddled child. They returned for the second egg. The chamber received them as if they had never left. When Jon put both hands on the second egg's sides to lift it, heat pressed into his palms more frankly, almost eager. It was the green egg. He felt it push against his hands, not moving but saying, in the way that the smell of fuller's earth says cleaning, "I am here." When all 3 eggs lay in the sledges and they had set their ropes to the giant's harness and one took the hauling line as gently as if he drew a child's toy, they came out into the yard of the night fort with the day leaning past its cold noon. The air outside tasted cleaner. It did not drive itself into Jon's lungs finely ground. It went down whole. He had not noticed how tight the tunnel's cold had been until he had a different wind in his chest. Ghost leaped up onto the sledge and curled himself beside the eggs, putting his body along them until he lay breath to stone. He did it as if compelled. The hairs lift along his spine gentled and went down. His jaw relaxed. He shut his eyes and had the look a wolf has when he drives his muzzle into snow where a hare passed and thought of hares. "Strange bedfellows," Tormund said softly. Even he had set more quiet. The men did not jest much on the way back. The world looked too new for old jokes or too old for new ones. Snow had begun again. It fell in the way it sometimes did, slow and thick, each flake a proper creature with its own small mind. John felt those minds alight on his cloak and his eyelashes and his hand when he raised it. He had the thought that the snow was making a careful count of what it covered, and had added 3 to its tally against the day when it would melt and give them back up. Back at Castle Black, they carried the sledges to a long, low room under the builder's hall where the stone kept cool in summer and moderate in winter. Yarwolf came to peer and shake his head and mutter his old good words to wood and stone. He ran his hand over the obsidian plates John had brought up as well, and said a thing very soft that might have been a prayer and might have been a sum. "Who flaked you and who set you? What price bit your edge?" John set guards and set Ed to fetch Sam's old notes where he had copied what Maester Eamon knew of dragon hatching. And then Sam was gone to Old Town, and the notes were not Sam. They were Sam's hand in a different life speaking in ink. He sent Iron Emmet to keep the word tight. He sent Mulliver to sleep and dream the dreams boys had in beds where the night had set a new measure on their minds. When the word came, it came not from a crow but from the smell of myrrh and smoke and a sweet spice that was not northern. Melisandre came into the builder's hall as if into a temple she had always owed a visit. Her boots did not creak. She looked on the eggs and made a sound John had not heard from her, something small and childish. Awe had always felt like a thing beneath her, a tool for other people. He saw it find her. "Do not touch," he said at once, and then hated himself for how quick it leaped from him. "These are under the care of the Night's Watch." She regarded him without affront. "You have found a song," she said. "A little piece of it." She bent her head and breathed in, slow, as if to find the thing with her blood as well as her nose. "I can taste the sea at their making, and the sap of a white wood, and hammerstone fire. They were not laid here. They were bound here. A woman's name rides the ash like a moth on a wind. I could catch it if you wished." "I do not wish," John said. "If names are to come out of these stones, they will come in their own time." "You speak like a young king," she said. He heard no mockery. "These stones are still as wise as kings are old. You will waste lives buying their waking. You might purchase the song in days rather than years." "With what coin?" John said. He could hear the men around them in the hall pretending not to listen but holding their breath. "Blood? I have too much blood here already. I will not buy heat from bleeding boys." "Not boys," she said. "The men who came here for a truth. The yellow-haired one with the good face. The woman with the broken tooth. The small man who knows 60 sad songs. What is every song to 3 songs that can be taught to flame?" John looked at her and let her see all his disgust. "No." She smiled, small and true. "We will argue again. But not tonight. The eggs are singing to the wrong fires still. They are speaking to the cold first. It is the oldest kind of courtship, heat and cold in a pact. You will need both." When she had gone, when the air remembered itself again, the men let their shoulders roll and breathed. Ed went and crouched by Ghost without petting him. "I had a hound once that slept by the hearth and would not let anyone poke at a kettle that did not belong to them," he said. He was as stupid as Snow, but he knew the hearth was someone's. He met John's eye. "It seems the wolf is the kettle now." "Keep watch," John said. "If the fire brightens, send for me." That night he dreamed no crypts. He dreamed instead of the wall from within, as if he were a fish under a frozen pond looking up at men walking with their bright little lights. He saw that the ice was not a single block but layer upon layer upon layer of winter laid down and tamped, and the old sorceries laid between them like fine cloths. He saw the places where the cloth had torn and men had mended the tear with a different weave. He saw roots, white and patient, threaded like sinew through the whole great body. And he saw, settled deep in a place the roots favored, a bowl made of men's knives turned into black glass. The knives had been carried by small hands and set down with little words. The bowl held 3 perfect ovals that had known much and waited longer still, and they were not dead. They were listening for footsteps. He reached out in the dream. He put his hand to the ice above the nest and felt something under it put its hand to him. He woke to Ed's hand on his shoulder. "I did not want to be the sort of man who wakes a Lord Commander in the night," Ed said. "But I find I am that sort of man." John's heart was already moving fast from the dream. "What?" "The green one," Ed said. It made a sound. The sound it had made was not the one John's blood had told him to expect. It was very small. It was the precise sound of a single tiny stone shifting against another. But it was a chosen sound. When he put his ear near the egg, he did not hear anything again. Ghost's ears leaned forward very slightly, like a pair of white leaves touched by a breath. The wolf's eye, only one glorious red visible with the lamplight, held a long, deep patience John had seen when Ghost watched a mouse hole as if it were a gate to a kingdom. John sat there until his legs went numb and his breath made a faint cloud that drifted like the sigh of some patient god. He did not move the egg or press his ear again. He knew that if he did and heard nothing, he would be like a fool who looks into a well and finds himself. Instead, he looked at it and let it look at him. He thought of his name and what names were made of. He thought of the promise a wall made that it would stand. He thought of a promise an egg made that it would break. He thought of his father, who had been a promise to himself and a mystery to his son. He thought of a woman's arms, dark hair on a white pillow, the acid of the lie that had needed telling to keep a boy alive. He thought there was no end to thinking, only a point where a man stood up and put his hands to a thing. When dawn came pale as dishwater, he went to Maester Eamon again and told him about the small sound. The old man turned his face into the brazier's warmth like a flower turning its face toward the memory of sun. "Dreams taught the first men much," Eamon said, "and unmade more. If the egg moved, you will not hurry it with your worry. But you might greet it properly." "How?" "Bread, milk, salt," Eamon said, smiling. "The old courtesies. It is a guest under your roof." It was nonsense. John did it anyway. He had the kitchen send up a trencher of brown bread, still warm, and a bowl of milk with the cream not skimmed, and a dish of coarse salt. The men laughed, but the laughter was not insulting, more like an old habit showing itself to see if the day would make room for it. John set the offerings near the straw where the eggs lay, and he sat with them until the milk skinned over and the lamp burned low. Tormund came and brought with him not laughter this time, but a story. He sat cross-legged on the floor, the giant of a man suddenly as patient as any nurse in a birthing. He told a tale of a great bird's nest high on an iron cliff where no man could climb. He told of a boy who had made ropes of his hair and his sister's hair and the hair of every woman who loved him and swung himself up. He told of how at the top the nest had been not a nest but a house, and the eggs not eggs but smooth stones, and how the boy had taken one and tucked it in his shirt for luck, and how the stone had warmed him all that long winter, and how in spring the stone had cracked and there had been a sound like a sigh and he had found his hand full of something he had never seen and could not name but that made his mother weep, and the tears had watered the barley and the barley had fed a village. "That is the way with taking a thing," Tormund said lightly. "It makes its own story after." It was a day of small business and a night of larger quiet. The ravens were unsettled. They pecked listlessly at their feed and fell to muttering in long sullen strings of syllables. Twice one screamed so sharply the men flinched. In the morning, frost had crept a little up the straw around the ash-blue egg, and the frost had made a pattern there that looked like veins of a leaf. The pattern was not there on the other eggs. It did not melt when he breathed on it. When he laid his hand on the egg, he felt the heat deeper, as if it had banked and now had more to show. Ghost's breath steamed quietly. The king came that afternoon, Stannis Baratheon on a dark mare with frost in her mane. He rode as if the horse were a duty. He dismounted with a face like iron, and the iron had not been polished. Behind him came the smell of men hungry for hope or at least for meat, and then Melisandre, and then a handful of knights whose tabards looked odd against the black stone. Stannis's eyes took in the room and set it in order and judged it wanting. Then they found the eggs and stopped judging, and something more human, more boyish, more dangerous moved in his face. He stepped forward as if to kneel without quite kneeling, and held his hand over the green egg, and the limb trembled just a hair because the man would not let it. "Dragons," he said, not loud. "Dragon eggs." Jon said, "It may be." "It is," Stannis said, as if his will were a tool. He finally knelt. He did not touch. His knuckles were white under the skin. "Do you know what has fallen into your care?" "I know what I see," Jon said. "I know what I need," Stannis said, still not moving. His voice thickened as if he were chewing something that would not swallow. "I need fire. I need a wind men cannot stand against. I need the sky to belong to me. I am not a poet. I am not a child. I will say it plain. If these can hatch, they are mine by right." Jon felt his old stubbornness stand up at his shoulder. "By what right, your grace?" "The right of a king to claim what will save the realm," Stannis said. "Everything else is a matter of men's comfort. Men die more comfortably when they think their terms matter. I will give you terms. I will—" He stopped himself, coughed like a man telling his throat who commanded here, and stood. "I will give you food, men. The safety of your little oath, if that pays for it. But this is destiny." Melisandre's voice came in then, soft as the down in a winter goose. "Destiny cannot be bartered, my king. Only delayed, and the delay is a debt that eats interest." She looked past Stannis to Jon. "They do not answer to his blood. They are listening for another name. It has the taste of winter to it." Jon met Stannis's eyes and did not drop them. "The Watch does not sell its vows," he said. "Not for bread, not for crowns." He thought of the eggs listening for a name. He did not think the name in his head. He stood where he was with all his weight out through his boots into the old stone. And he was his father's son in his face and the woman he had never known son in the stubborn line of his mouth. Stannis's jaw moved as if he bit into winter fruit. He nodded sharply once, as if to an order he would obey for now and punish later. "Then keep them," he said. "Keep them and learn them and fetch me what they will do. Do not give them to the Red Woman for her games. Do not let your friends slip them away for their own stories. Do not name them." He turned on his heel. "Do not make me ask again." When they had gone, when the door had closed and the men breathed out and the room felt a fraction itself again, Ed spoke into the quiet in a voice that made the air the same size as before. "Well," he said, "now we have dragons, a king, and a priestess all in a room, and we're still hungry." Hungry, yes. Jon felt it then, and not only in his belly. The hunger had laced itself through everyone and everything. The wall was hungry for quiet. The men were hungry for promise. The dead were hungry for breath. He found himself thinking of food they had not seen since autumn. A quince left to soften on a sill with a bee nuzzling at its skin. He found himself thinking of fire and salt and the way fat runs into a pan. He found himself thinking of his father's voice at dusk saying, "Enough." That night, Jon took a lamp and went back through the night fort to the chamber in the roots. Not because he thought to find there anything he had not already taken, but because he had the sense of leaving a table without thanking the cook. He went alone. The tunnel made its own weather again. The living face under the wall seemed to breathe as he passed. The chamber was as it had been, round and patient. He stood where the nest had been and set his lamp down and knelt and touched the dragon glass plates. They were cold now, proper cold. They did not answer his hand. But under them, so deep it might have been in his memory rather than in the stone, he felt a throb like the sea through a cliff. "Thank you," he said to nobody, "for what you kept, for how you kept it." The dark did not reply, but when he stood, he thought he heard a very small sound under the sound of his breathing, a sound like fine sand moving. He had the sense of having been allowed to hear it rather than having discovered it. When he went back up, the mouth of the live gate seemed to have the faintest dent at one corner, like the beginning of a smile. Days lengthened, which is to say they hung heavier. Men went about their work as if balancing bowls of oil on their heads. A raven died, and the others did not peck at its eyes but stood around it as if it might get up if they were decent. Ghost balked at leaving the builder's hall even to eat and had to be lured out into the yard like a child from under a table. When a drift fell from a roof and crashed to the ground, the sound made 3 men flinch and 1 weep and 2 laugh too loudly. The hum through the ice came and went. Once it was so strong John felt it through the soles of his feet when he stood on the wall like the roll of distant thunder. He began to spend hours in Eamon's cell, where the old man would press a book into John's hands and ask him to read some dry passage about the use of lime and the right dryness of wood for bellows, and then stop him with a lifted finger to ask what the wind was doing outside. "Listen," the maester would say, and John would close his mouth and hear the whole world turning in a way he had never heard it turn, as if someone had opened a door in his hearing and let in a tone that had been missing until now. "Do you hear the difference?" Eamon would ask. "The absence of a thing that wishes to be present. That is where the world's work happens, in absences." John would nod and then rage for an hour later in his chamber because he did not want to think of the world as a set of careful lacks. He wanted a thing he could hold. On the 5th day he held it. He did not go to the hall telling himself hope. He went telling himself habit. He went because Ghost had gone before him and would not answer a call. He went because the thought of not going left him with his skin wrong on his meat. When he came in, Ed was there with his mouth set and his eyes doing a ridiculous thing, shining wet in their corners as if a prank were being played on him by his own face. Iron Emmett stood very straight as if drilled. Tormund was not there. He had gone with arranging to speak to a clutch of free folk who had balked at a camp's move. Leathers held a hand out as if to keep the air from raveling away. The ash blue egg had cracked. The crack was a single hair, but it ran in a long curve from one side to the other like a river that had decided which way to go after a long winter. The green egg's surface had gone soft looking to his eye without changing under his hand, as if something beneath had drawn the hardness inward. The gray egg was as it had been, which is to say it had changed in ways only his blood noticed. He could not say how. He could not bear that he could not say. He sat with his hands on his knees and watched the crack not move. He watched it for a long time. He watched until his eyes hurt and his lower back complained and his right foot went numb. He watched until the men watched him. He watched until the crack made a sound, the smallest tap, and then another. Not regular, that would have been too simple, but chosen. He found his breath had paced itself to the sound. He did not move to touch it. He did not even lean. He felt instead his mouth shape a word, and he did not know whose word it was or if it was a word at all. It might have been a piece of a name. He did not say it aloud. The egg did not need his voice. He felt the wall above his head then as if he were under it again. He felt the old bindings prickle like a limb asleep. He felt something that was not him and was not the egg but was the agreement between them, and it made his hair rise on his arms under the fur. In the yard outside a horn sounded once, the hollow call like a cow lowing. Another answered, and then a fourth from farther than the second. The men in the hall looked at one another as if they had been caught at their cups. Ed stood. "I suppose," he said very dry, "that is the part where we do our other work." John stood. He did not want to stand. He wanted to sit until he learned the whole of the world's secret. He set his hand on the ash blue egg. It was warm, warmer than a man, warmer than his wolf's belly. It was the warmth of a mouth. He took his hand away. He left orders. He looked at Ghost and saw in the wolf's one burning eye a disregard for once that matched a man's. Ghost was not going anywhere. John went anyway. On the wall the wind ran east. The horns were for riders approaching under a flag, not for the dead. He had never been so glad to see men and horses appear mosquito small and grow as they came as now. Tormund led them, big as a remembered father, and beside him on a shagged brown pony rode a girl with hair winter white and eyes that looked like they had swallowed too much sky. She had the look of the old places as much as a person had ever looked to John. The men called her the one word that had walked through 100 mouths without breaking: child. The child came into the yard with her legs straight as little saplings and slid off the pony as if the pony had decided she had to be standing on the ground. She looked at John as if she were choosing whether to laugh or not. Then she looked past him toward the builder's hall and cocked her head like a bird who has heard a note the men have not. "You found them," she said, pleased and unsurprised. "They were angry and lonely. Now they are only angry. Who are you?" John asked soft. His voice did not want to be hard in front of her. "Leaf," she said. more to herself than to him, as if reciting a name someone else had given her long ago and she had carried like a stone in a pocket. She looked down, and when she lifted her eyes they were old. No, not old, fine, as if made by many careful hands. You would call me child, but that is what we called you. You came because Tormund told you, Jon said. I came because the sap ran, she said. I came because a door shut and opened. I came because a name woke and did not know its own tongue. I came because the egg called to the only cool that was a kindness. She went past him in a soft, quick run that made no sound and made every hair on his arm stir. She went into the hall. He found himself following her like a dog follows a boy who knows where the food is kept. Men moved out of her way without understanding why their bodies obeyed a law their heads did not know. At the eggs she sat cross-legged and put both hands on her knees and closed her eyes. She did not touch them, after a long time, long enough to measure what patience he had. She opened her eyes and looked at Jon and smiled, and for the first time since he knew the shape of her mouth it was properly a girl's smile. Do not put them in a fire, she said. Do not feed them a man. Do not name them to the red god. They are part stone and part tree now, and they hate both. You will have to teach them a new hatred. I am not much at teaching hate, Jon said. You are better than you think, she said, amused. You do not have the right hate yet. Hate the cold that kills. Hate the killing that thinks it is cold. Hate the end that pretends to be the beginning. Hate what would make everything one thing. He wanted to laugh. He did not. And how do I hatch them? You do not, she said. She reached out and let the tips of her fingers hover a hair's breadth over the ash-blue egg. You remember them. You let your blood remember them. Then you make a place where the remembering is warm enough and cold enough both, and then you wait more, and then when you think you have waited enough you wait more. That is the only magic men ever had that was worth anything. The waiting that keeps a fire. That will get men killed, he said. Everything that is not waiting gets men killed too, she said. You might decide what you would like them to die for. He could not help it. He thought of Eamon's hands and the old careful work of the wall's long quiet. He thought of his father telling him in a dream that a man's choices were the only maps he got. He thought of Ghost's red eye on the egg's skin. Help me, he said. I am helping you, she said. I came. He laughed then, a breath more than a sound. It shocked a couple of men into grins. Ed's mouth twitched as if he had been pinched. Iron Emmett studied the floor as if it had developed a new interest. Outside, the wind had swung north again. It carried with it a cold that had teeth and a smell like turned earth. Men smelled it and pulled their cloaks tight. Jon smelled it and thought of the crack in the egg and the fine patience in a child's face and a living gate smiling where no mouth should be. He felt the wall hum. He thought of love without naming it. He took the watch bell rope in his fist and pulled it twice. The sound went up like a plain truth into the white air. Men came. He saw their faces. Stubborn, greedy, kind, foolish, noble in small ways, terrified men's faces. He told them what they would do. He told them how quietly they would do it. He told them how long they would do it without complaint. He was a man who had never strongly liked the sound of his own voice. It surprised him how steady it came out now, as if a new floor had been laid under it. They built a room that was not a forge and not a rookery and not a chapel. They built it under the builder's hall where the stone held a chill, but the fires in the furnaces near it held a warmth that could be fetched but not forced. Yarwolf ran his hands over the bricks they chose and spoke to them the way a man might speak to a half-broke horse, coaxing rather than commanding. They set a hearth that could be banked so cunningly a man could hold his hand above it and not be burned while another man standing at his back would swear his spine was warmed. They ran channels for air that were not the obvious ones. They dug a trench along the north wall and lined it with white stone that had once been part of a broken heart tree's roots and that had never seen light until now. He did not ask how Leaf fetched it, and Leaf did not offer to tell. They hung no tapestries, no banners, no signs. They laid straw where the eggs lay, and then they took the straw away and laid clean sand, and then they took that away and laid cloth that felt like it had been woven in a place where wind was a weaver. They set a chair. It called it a throne. Jon ignored him. They set a little table with bread and milk and salt. Men came and went. The red woman came and stood at the door and did not cross and smiled oddly. Like a hunter who finds a trap she did not lay but approves. Stannis did not come. The giant did, peering in, and set his hand on the lintel with the care of someone greeting a newborn. The ravens came less often to the window and shouted less. The boy Mulliver came and stood with his mouth slightly open like a boy at midsummer fair, and then came again and again as if a high tide had taken his feet to that threshold at each high moon whether he had meant to come or not. The crack in the ash-blue egg lengthened the width of a hair, then of 2 hairs, then of a bean sprout. The green egg went duller, its flecks hiding. The gray egg drank the lamplight until the lamp seemed to dim when he set it near that shell. Jon stopped sleeping properly. Men told him when he had not eaten. Ghost slept and woke and slept with his nose pressed into the eggs as if to dream their dreaming for them. When Jon did sleep he dreamed of flying. Not the foolish dreams he had had as a child where he ran and then his feet forgot the ground, but dreams where he fell from a great height and did not mind because the air remembered him and lifted him up again, and not because it pitied him but because it had its own pride. One evening, when the weather sat on the castle like a slow giant, he sat alone with the eggs and the lamp and his own noise in his head. Leaf had gone to whisper to the roots, she said. Ed had gone to recite to the latrines. Tormund was out. The lamplight made a little halo around the green egg, and in that light he thought he saw the shell pull inward as if something under it had pressed against it and then relaxed. He leaned forward and set his hand against the shell and spoke the word his mouth had shaped before without any mind to stop him. He did not know that he had said it. He knew only that when he drew breath after he found the taste of it in his mouth, like the taste of iron after you have bitten your tongue. The egg answered with a sound so small he thought first he had imagined it. Then it came again, a tap arranged like a sentence in a language that was not a man's. His heart's pace changed to match it before he could tell it no. He did not call for anyone. He did not move. Ghost lifted his head and the lantern flame ticked. The ash-blue egg cracked wide enough to show a seam. The seam was not bright within. It was dark, a black deeper than the black of the dragonglass nest, a black like the inside of a shut eye. The crack ended without haste. Another formed. The green egg's surface shuddered like skin remembering its wound. The gray egg remained grave. He had the thought that this thing would take as long as it pleased, and the longer it took the more right it would be, and that any hand set to hurry it would be cut very neatly at the wrist by something without malice. He sat there until something in the dark seam flashed like a wet eye. That was when the horn blew from the west, 3 times in a row, thin with distance and thin with fear. The men in the yard shouted. The world rushed back like a sea. Jon stood, disbelieving his own body for moving away from what he had just seen. He was furious with the sound and with himself for obeying it. He stood anyway. He drew Longclaw because men in the yard expected their Lord Commander to come with a sword on and a face that told them which way to point theirs. At the door he looked back. The egg lay there singing its slow small song to a room that had been taught to sing back to it. The other work waited at the edge of his vision like a cliff. He went into it. He did not look back again until he had given his orders and set the men to their posts and spoken to the scouts and sent the ravens and walked the wall with wind trying to pour him hollow. He did not look back again because he would have turned to salt if he had. When at last he came down again, the lamp had gone out. The room drank the dark. Ghost's body was a ghost. Jon went toward the place where the eggs lay and knelt and set his hand on the straw because he did not know where his courage was otherwise. The straw was warm. He could feel it with his palm, not his mind's tricks. He leaned closer until his breath moved a curl of husk, and then he smiled because the smile came and because he had not asked it to. 3 small sounds answered his breath as if they were 3 notes in an old winter song, delicate and chosen and utterly certain. He did not call for anyone. He did not move at all. He closed his eyes and listened. The wall hummed around him. The old gods breathed. The red gods watched. The king dreamed. The dead turned their faces toward men's lights. The eggs cracked the world by a hair's hair. He felt as a boy feels when he stands in the stable and a mare's belly he has watched for months flutters under his hand and then settles and the mare blows out her breath and something begins that cannot be called back. The snow fell. The knight learned a new letter. He stayed, a man made of waiting. With his hand upon the straw and his wolf a white curve leaned around 3 small suns that had not yet burned. The waiting taught him his own breath. It went in. It went out. It fogged the air and laid a skin on the lamplight that the lamp shrugged off in a heartbeat. He learned. The exact sound of Ghost's ribs working under white fur when the wolf slept. The small catch that came when Ghost dreamed and the pads of his paws twitched against straw. He learned the difference between the straw's whisper when a mouse moved under it and the whisper when heat crept along it and dried it just enough to talk to itself. He learned to tell when the lamp's oil was ending by the lick of the flame. He sat and let the hours lean their weight along his shoulders and thought of nothing useful and everything that mattered, and the eggs made their patient taps like a pen writing in a hand he could almost read. Eamon came twice that day, once carried on a chair by 2 men and once with his own feet under him like stick legs the raven might use, stubborn and brittle and sure. The first time he had John read to him from a treatise on the care of small fires in damp places, which was a thing some careful monk had set down in Old Town before John's line had ever thought of raising a tower above a hot spring. The second time he came and said nothing at all. He sat with his old hands stowed under his sleeve like things afraid of being lost, and his face turned toward the warmth that slept under the straw, and he smiled once so small that only a man who had learned his own breath would have noticed. "Do you know what you look like?" Ed said to John at dusk when the light outside had gone the color of a bruise and the lamp in the corner had to do more work than it liked. "My mother had a cat that sat in the doorway every spring and watched a patch of dirt. It did it every day for a fortnight. She said it was waiting for mice. In the end, it turned out it was waiting for beans to sprout. It had no idea what it would do with a bean when it caught one, but it felt very proud of itself when the green showed and it swatted it. If I begin swatting seedlings, take the eggs away from me," John said. "I will," Ed said, "and then I'll put them back because you'll look sad." When the first egg broke in earnest, it did not do it with drama. The ash blue shell parted as a mouth parts in sleep to let a breath in. The seam that had been a hair became a line a child might draw across a page, then a fault, then a gentle split that did not race or leap but considered and continued as if it had all the time in the world. John could not say when exactly the change from crack to opening occurred. One moment he was watching a shell, and the next the world had a seam in it. Heat pushed up from within, not a rush but a certainty. It met the cool that the white stones along the north wall were giving off and the draft that the cunning vents invited and did not struggle. It made a place between them. Ghost lifted his head and set his chin on his paws as if this courtesy pleased him. A breath of scent reached John. Not smoke as men knew it, nor pitch nor hearth nor hot iron, but the smell of a fire that had not yet burned the thing it would burn, a promise, sappy and mineral both, a smell like the moment before a forge blushes. He had not meant to speak. When the shell's lip at last tipped back like a lid and he saw the first glimmer of something wet and dark within, his mouth found the word it had made for this thing and let it out with his next exhale. It had 2 syllables and no sense except that the sense belonged all to this. The syllables slid through the warm air like fish and laid themselves along the hatchling's earless skull, and he knew, without any man's writing or God's sign, that the name had gone where it must. He did not say it again. He did not need to. The small thing inside the egg did not look like a dragon until after it had found the world with a jointed snout, and pried a slice of the shell aside with a clever claw no bigger than a crow's black nail, and coughed. The cough was the smallest sound John had ever heard that made his heart try to come up into his throat. It was not a baby's weak mule. It was a thing testing its own noise and deciding where to put it. Then the head came free, slick with birth wet, black as wet coal and blue as old ice, with a line of pale spikes like the teeth of a saw running between the eyes and down the thin skull to where the neck would be. One eye opened. It was not red, not green, not gold. It was the color of candlelight seen through smoked glass, and it found John and stopped there, and the looking laid a weight on John's chest that he had not felt since a dire wolf pup had chosen his hand in a yard strewn with snow and surprised breath. Ghost flowed to his feet without a sound and put his muzzle very close to the little wet face. The hatchling showed teeth the size of pins and hissed a thread. It was not fear. It was declaration. Ghost breathed on it, slow and steady. The steam curled and condensed on the hatchling's head and ran in 3 lines down where scales would harden. The little head tilted. The small jaw closed. The hiss softened until it became a sound like a kettle beginning to simmer. 7 bloody hells, Iron Emmett said very softly from the doorway. He had not meant to be there. He had meant to stand guard and be a wall if Stannis came stomping or Melisandre came smiling. He had come anyway. Ed leaned his shoulder into Emmett's shoulder as if he could push the man back down the hall with his bones and not be noticed doing it. Emmett did not move. Leaf came as if the scent of the split shell had been a bell rung in her bones. She slid in along the wall with her feet making less noise than a moth's wings. She did not look at Jon or the men, not at Ghost, not at the lamp's flame. She looked at the hatching thing as if it were a book she had not expected to find in a house she did not know she owned. And the line of her mouth went soft and frank and innocent and so old his throat hurt. "Hush," she said, although no one had spoken. "It is hearing itself." The small thing should not have known how to be so certain with a body it had only just learned. It should have flailed or scrabbled. It pushed out of the egg with slow, considered movements, peeling itself free and then pausing to rest with its head on the shell's lip as if a journey had been made. It shook once, a quick cascade that sent droplets spattering and set the lamplight shard running along its skin. The scales were more skin than armor yet, soft to the eye, but under the softness lay a geometry that had weight and threat and beauty both. Pale veins ran like frost paths through the blue-black. Along the spine the little points rose like new thorns. The wings unfolded as a hand might open in sleep, thin and strange. The skin between the finger bones translucent enough for the lamp to sketch itself upon it. The lamp's halo showed a tracery nested in the membrane like the veins of a leaf pressed into a book. It took its first breath of the room as a whole creature. It took it as men take bread on a holy day. Then it sneezed because the air was the world and the world had dust in it. And the sneeze was ridiculous and made Ed clap his hand to his mouth to keep his laugh inside the cage of his teeth. The egg's smell deepened. The ash-blue shell collapsed in upon itself in 3 pieces, as if relieved of duty. Heat bled from the fragments like the last of a fever. Jon reached and gathered the broken halves and set them aside with a care his hands had not known how to show for anything that did not spill blood. When he turned back, the hatchling had its 4 feet braced, head up, throat long, as if to say, "Look." He looked. Somewhere behind him he heard Eamon's breath make a syllable that the old man did not have to shape with his mouth to make it say what it said. Yes. He held out his hand because some part of him remembered that he had held out his hand once before to a creature that would have bit and did not. The small head tipped. The nostrils flared. The tongue showed, a flicker quick as any snake's but forked not by venom's purpose but by something older that had found the same shape for a different reason. The tongue touched his knuckles and left behind a wet that did not feel like spit. Felt like a vow. "Do not name it," Eamon said. The old voice was a thread but it stitched the thought fast. "Do not. Let the world name it first." Jon swallowed. The word he had said once sang under his tongue like a secret kept for a friend. He nodded. The nod was a lie to himself or a promise. He did not know which. Ghost put the tip of his nose to the small chest and the dragon thing. There was no other word. Leaned into the touch as if an itch had been scratched and then climbed without being told onto the wolf's foreleg and set itself there, a curved bit of living cobalt, and arranged its tail with ridiculous seriousness so that it lay over Ghost's paw as if that were a thing all dragons knew to do. Ghost did not move except for his eye, which watched Jon with the expression that said very clearly, "As you see." "Tell me I am dreaming," Ed said softly, a man imploring a god to lie to him for an hour. "If you were dreaming," Jon said, "you would be warmer." Another sound then, different. The green egg. Not as far along, its surface still holding its freckles of metal dawn, shivered. Not a quake a man would notice with his foot on earth, but a change along the edge where shell met straw, a ripple that ran like a mouse under a rug. The shell did not split. The ripple settled. When it settled, the air over the egg felt thicker to breathe, as if someone had added a curtain and a threshold to the small world inside the room. 2, Leaf breathed, savoring the number as if it were a taste. The third will be as slow as a tree. Slow? It said. Good. There has not been enough of that. He fetched a dish of water without being asked and set it near the straw. He did it with the elaborate heedlessness of a man pretending he has fed dragons every day of his life. The hatchling ignored the dish with all the scorn of a princeling who has been offered broth when he demanded wine. Turned its head toward John again. He raised his palm and held it a handspan away, and the creature rose on its little forelegs and pressed its muzzle to his skin and breathed. It was hotter there than it had been through Shell. The heat had a weight to it, like a heavy blanket against his palm. Do you remember? Eamon asked the room. How men say dragons always know their own? I remember hearing that, Ed said. I also remember men saying geese can count, and that if you have 6 and steal one they scream a scandal worse for the missing than if you took a son. I never had a goose. I find dragons more plausible. They do not know blood, Eamon said. Not as men count blood. They know a steadiness. They know a kind of hunger. If you feed them the right want, they will call you theirs. He turned his blind face toward John with uncanny accuracy. Do not feed them anything you are not content to carry to your grave. John had no notion how to heed that advice except to be the man he had been the day before and the one before that, which seemed like both too much and too little. He sat again and watched the hatchling's sides move and the lamplight draw a migrating river on its slick hide. Leaf came closer and put 2 fingers an inch above the small back and did not touch. The child's face changed to a thing John could only call reverence, the kind he had seen on the faces of very old women in Winterfell except on mornings when the sun had come to sit in the window as if to be forgiven for rising at all. What did you do with them? John asked her quietly. We heard them, she said. We told the roots to hold a song for them until men remembered. Men forgot sooner than I thought. Her lips made a small rueful shape at that. But men forget quickly. It is one of the things that saved you. How? You do not remember the power of your own doors, she said. So you leave them shut. It has kept the world the size it is. If men knew how large it is, they would spill themselves into all of it and drown. Melisandre came at dusk when the color had been squeezed out of the day and left somewhere else, and the lamp's small world was all that anyone could have. She did not come alone. 2 of Stannis's men followed, their eyes trying to play at being mirrors and failing. She stopped an arm's length from the threshold. The red stone at her throat held a warm coal in it that did not care about the room's war between hot and cold. So, she said, and it was not a question. Her eyes found the little life with no difficulty. That was something in her favor. She could look into a small good without trying to force it to be a large plan. The corners of her mouth began to lift, the beginnings of triumph. But then she saw Ghost's white body curved as it was around the small creature, and something changed in her face, something almost like thoughtfulness. It is nearer to the snow than to the fire, she said very low, as if not to tell her own king on accident. Curious. You will keep your distance, John said. If you meant to help before, you were not needed. If you mean to help now, you are not wanted. How clever men are when the world is small, she said, and the smile completed itself but had no heat. She looked again at the hatchling. It looked back. If the Red Priestess felt the way it looked, she did not show it. It will hunger, she said in that soft tone that made men think they had chosen a thing she had made for them. You will pay for its meat with men. You will pay for its temper with men. You will pay for its living. That is not a cruelty. It is accounting. Better kings than the one in the yard have proved. Better men than you. It is only the way of riches. She put a hand to the stone at her throat. But no, if it feeds on the right fire first, it will not break when the cold comes. If it feeds on the wrong fires first, it will crack like a poor man's bowl. She eyed Leaf then as if the child of the forest were smuggled past her at a border. The tree's hum is a poor diet for a thing that must burn. The trees kept it alive, Leaf said. Men's fires killed the others. Men's fires freed them, Melisandre said. From stone, from women, from time. From men, Leaf said, and her little teeth showed a wolfish inch. John stepped between them with his face as the wall he had. Enough! He had not raised his voice. The word stopped anyway. You will not bargain here. You will not offer me prices. Leave. Melisandre's delight at being refused, if delight was what it was almost pleasant. She loved men who thought their refusals were doors and did not see how their steps turned corridors whether they meant to walk or not. Very well. She made a small bow that was both mocking and sincere. This is a beautiful thing you have, she told him, as if she told him his wife was pretty. May it not unmake you. The men with her looked as if they had been holding their breath to keep her warmth from cutting them. When they went, the air remembered itself, and the hatchling snapped its tiny jaws on nothing and was content. When Tormund returned, he did not bother with his usual booming. He came in with snow in his beard and quiet on his mouth and went at once to his knees with his elbows on his thighs and his fists hanging like hammers. He looked at the creature for a long time and then looked at Jon and made a small rude gesture with his chin. Well, he said, you took your time. It took its time, Jon said. Everything that matters does, Tormund said, settling on his heels. You should have seen my first wife. We waited 3 nights in a snow drift for her father to fall asleep so we could take the blanket. By the end of it, I was in love with the blanket. The woman was a bonus. He drew a hand down his beard, sending frost to the rushes like salt. His eyes went soft. I have seen one before, he said, startling himself by admitting it. Years ago, when I thought I was younger than the trees, north of the Milkwater, a dead valley where nothing wanted to grow except stones. There was an old woman there sat in a boat that had not seen water for 1,000 summers. She had a thing in her lap that had died before it lived. It was a dragon egg. She said it had fallen from the sky before her mother's mother was born and had lain in her mother's lap and her mother's mother's and hers, and it had warmed her in winter and made her babies die less often. When she died, the egg would go to her daughter. When the women were all gone, the egg would still be there and it would hatch as a stone. I laughed at her and then I didn't. He shook his head at the remembered story. I might laugh again now. It is not a stone, Ed said, squinting as if that had been the confusion. I know. I watched it not be. The night after the hatching, the cold came in as if it had been listening at the walls and had decided that if a small summer had been born in the builder's hall, it would take itself elsewhere for spite. The stars burned clean. The auroral smear in the north sharpened into a sword edge that bit so finely that men on the wall said they tasted iron and remembered kin who had died outside and men who had never had kin to begin with, and they wept without knowing why and then stopped and pretended their faces were only cold. Jon walked the parapets and felt the walls hum steady and deeper than before, as if a heavier sleeper had turned and found a better place in the bed. A riderless horse came in from the west that night with its tail frozen into a single hard thing like a club, and its back lather turned to lace and its eyes rolled white as an egg's. The men who met it did not shout. They took the bridle and spoke nonsense to it and let it sob its breath until the sobs gave out. It had no rider to explain itself. The 4 men who had gone out to the lakes west of Molestown came in 2 days later under a sky that pretended it had room for light and did not. They had left their 5th with the ice because he did not know he had no face. His face lay on the snow as a mask does and had frozen into a shape nobody who had loved him would have recognized. The ones who came back did not talk much. Eamon touched their wrists and named them for themselves and gave them broth and sent them to bed. The hatchling slept through it all with its head tucked under the thin hook of its wing and its tail over Ghost's paw, as if the one thing in the world that must not change was that white bone under its tail. Stannis did not come again himself. He sent men to ask and others to listen. His need, Jon could feel that hot, grim need, stood at the edge of the hall like a man with no manners waiting to be invited to sit. Jon did not invite it. He sent word instead that he would send word. It felt like a child's trick with cards and cups. He hated it. He did it anyway. Melisandre did not come either. When Jon passed her in the yard, she inclined that bright head and did not speak. He felt some new calculation in her change the angles of her attention. It did not alter him. He saw to bread and meat and furs and fires and 100 small miseries. He watched men's boots and the seams of their gloves. He caught a boy stealing a thing he needed more than the man he had taken it from and made him give it back with words that made the boy cry and kept the man from crowing. He walked and watched and went down when the watching had made him raw and sat again near the straw and found his breath. The second egg began to crack in earnest on the fourth day after the first. It did it like a drunk trying to sing a hymn, bold and bad and beautiful for all that. The green shell parted in 3 slapdash faults, spurting sap scent where it tore, and the creature within was stronger than its sibling Ha. Deep in, or surer, or impatient. It kicked the shell away with a hind leg and showed a span of wing that was green, not like a leaf in summer, but like river water that runs under ice and remembers what sunlight does later. This one's I had gold in it. Not the brazen shine of coin, but the soft eldering of wheat under late sun. Leaf watched and cocked her head and said a word in her own small tongue that meant something like a green thing that is not a tree. "Do not say it to me," John told her when his mouth found that private word again. "It is mine or it is the world's, but it is not yours." "Words do not belong to men," Leaf said cheerfully. "But have your sport." The tiny dragon turned its head at the sound of her voice and hissed with more temper than the first had shown. "Yes, you too," she told it, delighted. "We are all full of dislikes. It is the easiest kind of full." One came then, drawn by nothing more complicated than curiosity that had nowhere else to go. He put his head under the lintel like a man ducking his way into a memory and made a sound of wonder to see a thing small that would one day be great. The green hatchling did not like the giant's smell. It flattened itself and arched and made that ridiculous whir that might have been threat or might have been nervousness. One rumbled back a soothing sound that he might have made for a frightened goat on the trail and, astonishingly, the tiny animal stayed itself and put its head down and breathed and allowed the giant's breath to wash over it. Ghost, who had decided that he was old enough to supervise princes, blinked his eye at one, then at John, and then closed it very slowly as if to say, "See, even giants can learn." "Don't teach it any of your bad habits," Ed told the giant. "It will be drinking a tub of ale and trying to wrestle a windmill by next week." "Windmills make poor wrestling," one said gravely in his half-learned tongue. "Break easy. Hurt in old bone here." He touched his knee with a finger the size of a man's wrist and grinned, a huge sad grin, as if the memory of a broken windmill were a tender thing to him. Word ran through the castle like water in a trench that the second had come. The third did not care. The gray shell turned no color that the lamp could find and took none away. It sat in its bed of cloth and cool and heat and a wolf's breath and a man's patience and remembered something older than any of them. John could feel it sometimes in his teeth, a faint ringing that came and went. When he spoke near it, he felt the words lay down on the shell like hands. He stopped speaking near it unless he meant the words to put their weight there. He found himself rationing his own voice. Stannis sent Davos seaworth in the end. John was almost glad of it. The Onion Knight had a face like a harbor in poor weather, rough and honest and battered by waves, and he came into the room with care that was not fear, the care of a man who has seen things better than his hand be broken by too much love. He bowed, awkwardly. He stood with his thumbs at his belt, as if unsure what a man did with hands in the face of a thing like this. "My lord," Davos said with that gentle voice that made men let him tell them the truth. He saw the 2 hatchlings on the straw by Ghost's curve and his face changed, the way faces do when old sadness and new joy meet. "I was a smuggler," he said to them as much as to John. "I carried fire over water once and lost fingers to the cost. I never thought I'd see the fire's first breath. I will not be smuggling these anywhere," John said. "No," Davos agreed. "You won't, and you won't be keeping them anywhere either, not forever. They will keep you if they can." He swallowed his own opinion in front of it. He was very good at that. "His Grace sent me to see that you have what you need to keep them alive, so that when they are old enough to be of use, he may have cause to ask you for them again." "Ask," John echoed. "Ask," Davos said. "Or lay siege, or make a gift first. He hasn't decided what shape his wanting will take." He nodded toward the straw. "This is a better wanting than most. I've seen a great many wantings." This one at least has some hope of feeding someone besides the man who wants. Hope is dear, John said. Aye, Davos said, but cheaper than despair when it comes to selling men on a cause. He stepped forward one slow step and bent as if to look under a boat for a cracked rib. May I? He meant to breathe the smell, to let it sit in his hair and beard so he could carry it back to his king in a way no parchment could. John did not stop him. He bent. He breathed. He was a father again for a second. Then he straightened and wiped the heel of his hand quickly over his eye and laughed at himself for it without any shame. It is good to be a fool again at my age, he said. It makes me feel I haven't wasted the years being too clever. In the nights that followed, trouble tested the seams. 2 of Stannis's older knights, men of proud houses too far south to love this cold, decided that destiny would be better served if destiny were in their saddlebags. They came with soft boots and careful steps and a sack that smelled of salt and old wool, and their breath held as if that would tell their hearts to cease beating. Ghost had been asleep in the curve of his charges. He lifted his head without any fuss. He did not snarl. He did not so much as show a tooth. He simply stood. The men found themselves unable to remember how to put one foot in front of the other because the floor seemed to be a sea and their shoes 2 rotten little boats and Ghost the white reef ahead. Ed appeared behind them as if he had been born in the stones with a club in his hand and a complaint on his mouth. I was fond of my nose, he said. I would not advise making the wolf curious about it. They went to the ice cells with faces so blank John knew he had nearly killed them and had made them alive again by letting their hearts remember that they were fallible. He hated the feeling that he had such power. He put it away where he put the other things he had to hold and not think about. A corpse came out of the trees one sunset and walked until it found the fence and then walked into it and kept walking into it because walking was what it knew. Its eyes were not blue with that terrible light. They were dull and hard with ice, and its lips were frozen to its teeth in a grin. John had not seen one like that before. The men speared it from a distance and burned it, and it smelled like tallow and salt like any meat does. Ed watched it burn and said, Every man thinks the dead are one thing. They're like us instead. All different and differently disappointing. That night the 3rd egg rang faintly under John's hand, and he dreamed of roots wrapped around stone hives and the way a bee's small diligent body makes a weight in the air that men can feel when they sit very still. On the 8th day after the first hatching, the gray egg took a breath. That was the only way to think of it. The shell rose and fell very slightly under John's hand, and he felt the lift with his palm and his forearm and his shoulder and somewhere in his chest, as if the thing within had borrowed his ribs and used them in the right way and returned them when done. He did not speak its name. He had thought he would not make one. It made its own. He felt it. It was 1 syllable or 7, depending on how a man counted, and it had the taste of old iron and the first snow on a hot stone in autumn. When it cracked at last, it did it without haste and without show. If the first had been sleep-waking and the second had been a drunk's hymn, the third was a gate that had been unlatched a long time ago and only now swung wide because the wind had come from the right angle to carry it. The shell did not shatter. It parted along a seam that seemed to have been drawn there long ago by a wiser hand. The creature within came forth gray as rain with shadows within the gray like fish under a lake. Its eyes were dark as the shell had been, and only when it found John did a little old light show there, a pinprick caught from some star. Its wing lengths were narrow, its head blunter than its siblings, as if a different smith had had it on his bench, and when it breathed the breath did not smell like anything he could name. He left his hand there. The small head set itself under his palm, as if a shelter had been found that was not a roof. Ah, Eamon said from his chair, the sound as soft as felt. Now I am done. He had not meant to say that aloud. Startled him. He laughed once, embarrassed at his own truth. Forgive an old man his melodrama. You are not done, John said, too quickly because the thought hurt him. You are needed. I am as needed as a feather on an anvil, Eamon said, amused with himself and with John and with the world. But let me be content that I did not die 3 days ago. It is a luxury for the old to count days instead of years. The three slept together that night with their little bodies an untidy knot of damp heat and soft edges on a bed of clean sand that Ed had fetched in grumbling trips and Leaf had smoothed with her hand as a woman smooths the blanket at a child's feet. Ghost lay with his muzzle across them, and his breath made a cloud, and his one red eye glowed and faded and glowed as the lamp did. John did not sleep. He could not. He sat with his back to the cold stones and watched them breathe and listened to the wall breathe and felt the small bells ring in his bones that were not bells and not bones either, but something hung there by an older hand. He thought then, because he had the quiet for it and because watching small creatures sleep is an act that makes men honest in their heads, of Ed Stark, the man who had raised him and kept his name and kept him alive by a lie. He thought not of the sword that man had carried or the heads that sword had cut, but of the way his father had stood in a doorway and held it open his whole life so that his children walked through into a world that did not deserve them. He thought of women's arms he had laid his head in and left, and the way the leaving had made something crooked in him straight, for a while. He thought of the dead as if they were not coming for him but waiting for him to join them, which is another way of saying the same thing. He thought of the word he had said to the first. It burned the back of his tongue for a second with an old taste. He swallowed. He did not say it again. The next day he carried each small dragon in his hands in turn. He had not meant to. He had meant to let them be carried by time. His hands did it without asking him. They were heavier than they looked and lighter than any fear. Their bones like birds and not, the tails alive and certain, the claws careful because they were young and wise both. He carried the blue-black first and felt its heart jump under its breastbone against his palm. 3 quick knocks, then a pause, then 3 more, as if it were speaking a number it liked to itself. He carried the green and it thrashed at his sleeve and tried to worry the fur on his cuff, and then decided it would rather lick the salt from his skin between his thumb and forefinger and did so with care and intent. He carried the gray, and the gray went completely still except for its jaw, which worked as if it were chewing a thought and testing the shape of it on its little teeth. He did 1 lap of the room with each and then set them down and felt as if he had gone out to sea and returned with all his fingers. "Do you know what you've got?" Tormund said. He did not wait for an answer. "You've got 3 stones that will ask for your life every day and repay you with the chance to see a new day. Not many men get a bargain like that. I haven't had a bargain yet that didn't put a knife in my pocket and ask me to carry it without cutting myself," John said. "That's a bargain worth making," Tormund said. "You can cut someone else when they deserve it. Just don't fall on it and bleed like a goat." The first time the blue-black opened its mouth and made fire, it was not with the grand crack men's songs promised or the roar of furnaces that made cities. It was a cough that had learned a trick. It coughed, and a tongue of pale flame licked out of its dark small mouth and curled toward the lamp as if to taste its elder's beard. The lamp answered with a puff. The dragon sneezed and looked offended, and Ghost lifted his head to say, politely, "Mind yourself." John felt the heat on his knuckles where the flame had curled, and it felt, wrong to say clean. It did not scorch hair. It did not blister him. It did the exact amount of heat a man's body can learn to live with. He prayed then, without calling it prayer, that the fire would never learn other ways. He knew it would. He pressed the thought down and folded it away and put another thought on top of it: bread, oil, meat, the names of men he would send to fix the northmost switchback on the stairs up the wall, and called that thought an honest wait. There came a day when Stannis tried to take them. It had been inevitable. He came with 5 men and a woman. Melisandre was not among them. And a letter in his hand that made a crown of itself in his palm and cut him. He came like a hard winter settling on a field that had been spared the first 6 storms and had thought itself lucky. John stood in the doorway of the room as if his body had learned the shape of that timber and had decided it would be a beam for once. He held no sword. Longclaw was in its place in his chamber. He held his hands loosely at his sides because he did not trust them not to clench and look like threats when he meant only to keep. "I am not here to argue," Stannis said, "or to wheedle, or to beg. I am here to take delivery of what I have waited for since I had the wit to understand what to want." He held up the letter. "If you want parchment here, the law is the ink on this. The realm is the hand. The king is the ink's keeper. The wall is older than your law," John said. "It is older than mine," Stannis said without a blink, "and older than you. And it will fall if I do not set these above it. You cannot fly your vow against the wind and hope it will bear the weight." Davos shifted, a man trying to stand back and failing. His mouth tightened because the truth had to be spoken. "My lord!" "No," Stannis said, without looking away from Jon. The blue-black hatchling lifted its head then, and made a noise that was not a hiss, and not a chirr, and not a reptile sound, and not a bird's either. It was a sound that made the Red Priestess, who had come after all and stood a pace behind her king's left shoulder as if she grew there like a spot of blood on white skin, tilt her head. It was the sound of a lock finding its key. The green scooted its small body closer to Ghost's elbow and put its mouth to his fur and chewed very delicately as if something important lived there. The gray went completely still and fixed its black eye on Stannis and did not blink and did not breathe for a counting of 20 heartbeats, and then breathed again as if a decision had been made and would not be revised. Leaf spoke from a shadow so thin that Jon would have sworn there was no shadow there. He had not seen her come. Stannis had not seen her come. Melisandre had. Their eyes found each other like two knives on a table. Leaf said, "If you take them beyond the roots, they will die. If you feed them on a fire that does not know the old words, they will burn and nothing they burn will stay burned. If you give them to a man who would be king because he has a better claim than the next man, they will only ever be his argument." She smiled prettily as if she had said she would like a bit of milk. "If you leave them where they are, they will be the world's answer." Stannis had patience when it served his story. It did not serve him now. He drew breath to speak, and his mouth opened on a speech that would have driven spikes into all of them and hung banners from those spikes. He looked into the room and saw the small bodies there and the white curve of the wolf around them and the old stones that had held the castle up since men's names were new and something in him. Some boy who had looked at a story and wanted to step into it, faltered. He closed his mouth. He resheathed his anger like a sword withdrawn because to wave it would look foolish. He had self-respect even when he had no pity. He let his breath out through his nose and it smoked and showed how mortal he was. "Keep your pets," he said, making the word more clean than most men could manage. "Make them ready. I will come again. If you cannot tell me then that they are the realms, I will take them and risk being wrong." He turned and was gone like weather. "You have until spring," Davos said quietly, as if he were talking about fish and tides. "Or until he runs out of barley, whichever comes sooner." "Spring," Ed said somewhere behind Jon, bleak. "So 3 days." They did not talk much after that. Talking had gotten them nowhere Stannis wanted and everywhere Jon did not. Men went back to the work that had to be done to keep life from shaking itself free. The hatchlings learned to eat mice and then bits of salted pork and then bits of fresh meat warmed in the fire's blink and held in Jon's bare fingers until the heat bit his skin and then offered. They learned to play, if it could be called that, pouncing on bits of leather and each other's tails with care and then with less care and then with violence and then with care again, as if learning the limits of their own strength was work they enjoyed doing. The blue-black learned to climb the length of Jon's sleeve and sit on his shoulder like a cinder that had refused to be brushed away. The green liked the highest place in the room and would find a beam or a D's rafters and hang there, upside down sometimes, to look at the men as if they were a spectacle and she the audience. The gray learned silence. It could curl itself into a shape in the corner of the room and become a piece of the room that made the room itself more itself, unremarkable until a man tried to set his foot there and then found that the floor was alive and watching him. Ghost became very pleased with his job. Jon had never seen the wolf pleased before. He had seen him content, watchful, playful with a meat bone. Pleased was different. It sat at the base of Ghost's ears and made them twitch just so when the green scuttled and the blue coughed and the gray pretended to be a stone and then turned back again when Ed swore he had known it all along. Jon felt a foolish serenity watching that great white head lay itself along small backs and was angry at himself for that serenity until he let it fit where it fit and stopped being a boy about himself. Eamon grew quieter. Jon had thought the old man a furnace that had been banked and would give out a warm for as long as men remembered to feed it a pinch of coal. He was wrong. There was less of him each morning. He carried his cups with care not to spill as always, but the cup was smaller now. Sometimes he would put his hand to the eggs, shells now cold and hung from the rafters like old helmets, and speak a word Jon could not hear, then smile and close his blind eyes. Once he asked Jon to bring him a bowl of snow. "There is a taste in it that you do not get from water," he said. I own that I will miss it when I go south. You are not going south, Jon said. I am, child, Eamon said gently, and the old kindness made Jon's anger foolish at once. All men go south in the end. Downhill, down to a river, down a throat, down. He touched Jon's sleeve. Do not mistake being ready for a thing for wanting it. I want to see them fly once. That is greed. I will put it away and be satisfied with one opening mouth. On a morning when the world had that clean sound it gets just after a storm has moved on and the snow compacts under boots with little cries, Jon took the blue-black up to the top of the wall. He carried it inside his cloak like a silly contraband. When he took it out in the watchtower's lee, the hatchling made an annoyed sound at the cold and then leaned into the cold as a man leans into a wind that pushes him along and makes walking easier if you give yourself to it. The sky was a glass bowl upturned, and the far north's green knife lay along it like a jealous finger. The world ran away from them in white and black and blue. Jon set the little thing on the stone, and it made a sound he had not heard it make before, small and thrilled and almost tender. Do not, he said, a father to a child whose courage made him want to shut him in a chest. It tested the edge of the stone with a hand and found there was nothing for a hand. It opened its small wings and found there was no place for wings. It turned and put its feet back toward Jon's boot with adult good sense and climbed his trouser and sat on his knee and lifted its head and let the wind lift the little crest along its neck and was content with that. When you fly, Jon said to it, and there was no dignity in saying it and he did not mind, do not forget to come back down where men are. Cast its eye up at him. It seemed to judge him and find him pleasing enough. He saw then, in his mind's foolish eye or in the wall's old stone where many things have been reflected and then shown again for men who need them, a great shadow crossing the snow in summer, a breath that burned blue as the seam of a good coal, a roar that was not fire but the thing fire does to men's courage if it loves you. He saw other things he did not want to name. He put them away in the same place. He kept the knowledge that every man who stood beside him would leave him in the end, by death or by choice, and he would keep standing because that was the only work he was certain he had been made to do. On the way down he met a boy, Mulliver, with his wrists too thick for his sleeves and his hair trying to curl around his ears because he did not know yet how to tell it what to do, who looked at the bundle inside Jon's cloak with a dog's hunger for mystery and feared being rude and swallowed the looking like a stone. Do you want to see? Jon asked. He had meant to go on. He did not. The boy nodded and shook his head, embarrassed by his own greed. Jon opened the cloak and the little head peeped out as if from a nest. Mulliver made a little sound like a man punched softly in the belly. He put his hand out and then jerked it back and then set it again, as if he needed to teach his fingers to trust him. The dragonlet sniffed his knuckles and licked the salt and decided that the boy was not a threat and not an interest and tucked its head back in, which insult made Mulliver glow as if he had been named a friend by a lord. He lived the rest of that day with his feet lighter by a pound. That night the others came near enough that the wall sweated in lines like tears and froze and made new lace that looked like the work of a great old lady who had lived too long but whose hands had never forgotten their own cleverness. Men saw shadows where there were none. Men heard horns where no horn had blown. One man walked off the step in daylight because he had turned to look at a thing that had no light and thought it had. The corpse that had been burnt 3 days before rattled at the memory of its ribs under the ash, and the ash gave a whisper that sounded like a laugh and then settled. The green hatchling raised its head and hissed at the north with all the fervor of a cat, and the blue-black made no sound and set itself along Ghost's spine and erected the little line of thorns there, as if to be a second spine for the wolf, and the gray became a shadow so good at being a shadow that light forgot its duties around it. Leaf went to the roots. The living face under the night fort breathed so deeply Jon felt it on the hairs of his shin. The old gate's mouth softened as if it were dreaming a better dream. That night he dreamed he was under the wall again. But this time he was the ice and the men on it were the ones in the sleeping and the little hearts nested in his cold were his to keep so long as he remembered their names and the TLC they required. He woke and the name of the first lay on his tongue like a cherry stone. He did not spit it out. He did not swallow it. He simply held it there and let it trouble him and take the flavor of the milk he drank and the bread he chewed. It was his. He did not deserve it. It was his anyway. When the sun came up a day later more pallid than any man had a right to call a sun, Stannis sent again, this time not with a letter but with a wagon of flour and another of salt beef and a third of oats and a small chest of coin that nobody in the north had much use for and a large bundle of arrows that men would have use for until their hands were too cold to pull a bow. Jon took them. He sent back a message with Davos that said only, "Wait." Davos read it and looked at Jon and laughed a little as if at a joke only they understood. "You play a long game for a man who has so little time." "I have as much time as a man has," Jon said. "No more. If I have any less it is because someone cuts it from me. And if they do, they will get a short piece of rope for it in return." "Not if you are dead," Davos said. "Then the rope will go to someone who deserves it more," Jon said. He thought then of Bowen Marsh, and of knives under his ribs and the smell of cold iron and screams that his mouth had wanted to make and had not, and of a door and of Ghost on the wrong side of it, and of the taste of blood. He had lived it. He could live it again. He did not know what had happened to the man in that other world. He only knew that in this one he would not let the door shut with the White Wolf outside it. He would not. He set his palm to Ghost's skull and felt the heat go into him as if he were the hearth. The wolf leaned his weight into that hand as if a log had been pushed against a back and found a pressure it had wanted for an hour. On a noon that could have been any other, a raven flew to the yard and landed on the line set for drying harness and gave a croak that sounded like a man's name in a language nobody knew and everyone understood. It hopped toward the builder's hall, tilted its head at the door, and began to sing, if such a noise could be called singing. It was a set of broken notes that somehow made an old shape. Eamon laughed at the sound and lifted his old shaking hand and said, "That is for me," and went with it. Jon watched him go. He wanted to follow him to the last fire and warm his hands there. He stood where he was instead and watched a small blue-black thing test the iron ring on the floor with its teeth and decide that it was not a food and not an enemy and not a friend and therefore of no importance. The days after that were the sort of days men do not put into songs because songs like to leap from cliff to cliff and forget the paths that made the leaping meaningful. The dragons learned how to be creatures who ate and slept and curled and stretched and flared and, once, flew from the top of the chair to the table with a ridiculous flurry as if the air had held them up by the scruff like kittens. Men learned how to move around them, the way men learn how to move around any new thing they revere, with clumsiness that becomes grace. Stannis did not come. Melisandre watched with the patience of a spider. The free folk sent more women and boys, and men who had lost their tribes and had no tribe to gain but this wall and its work. And Jon took them and measured their hands against the needs of the place and set them there. The cold tested the seams. The dead tested them. The living tested them worse. One evening, just before the lamp would be lit, Ghost cocked his ear at a sound outside the room and rose and went to the door without troubling to be secretive. Jon followed as a man follows his hound into a field where he knows something is wrong with the lambs. Ed fell in at his shoulder with the look of a man who expects to be disappointed and hopes he will be. In the yard, a woman stood with her hair stuck to her cheeks with cold sweat and a deer hide over her arms like a mantle. She had the lean look of the far north and the good teeth of someone who had not wasted food on sweetness. At her feet were two boys and a girl and a bundle that could have been a sleeping dog or a sleeping child or an old man's harvest of rags. "We are chased," she said without preface, looking past Jon at the wall as if asking it to intervene on her behalf. "Not by crows." She saw the black and narrowed her eyes at her own joke. "Not by men. By the White Prince." "How far?" Jon said. 3 hours this morning," she said. The old man fell. The prince did not mind. "They will come where they will." "Bring them in," Jon said. He was past weighing whether every mouth made sense. There are moments when counting is treason. "Ed." "I know," Ed said. "I will show them to their bed and steal their boots and feed them lentils and tell them why they love it." That night, the prince came up to the fence and then did not cross because the fence was blessed by nothing except men's cuffs and the fact that the men who had hammered it together had been whistling badly and had meant well. Jon stood on the parapet and watched the dark and saw only dark and heard only his own blood and the old hum. He felt again, for the space of one breath, the door shut with Ghost outside it and the knives under his ribs and shook because there are some echoes so big a man cannot front them down. Then he breathed again, and the echo folded away, and the men around him saw only their Lord Commander standing with his hand on a stone, as if the stone were family. When he went down, green and blue-black were curled with Ghost, but the gray was not where he had left it. He found it a moment later in the shadow under the table, watching the door with its small head slightly cocked so that it saw the world askew and saw it truer for that. He crouched and put his hand where it could see it, and it put its nose against his skin and made a sound he would have sworn was contentment if dragons could be said to be more than fire and bone and want. He wanted then, shameful and glorious, to take it into his arms and hide it from everything that would make a price for it. He did not. He turned his hand and let the little jaw fit into the curve there between thumb and forefinger where human hands remember holding chicks and secrets and pain. He thought of the men he would have to send to their deaths, and of the boys he would keep from it, and of the lines that would be drawn over the next months that would cut him and others, and of the king who would come with his law and his need and his stubborn, and of the woman who would come with her God and her need and her warmth and her stubborn, and of the trees with their old hum and their newer accommodations, and the way they looked at men like a teacher amused by a bright boy who thinks he has invented numbers. He thought of spring said aloud and spring that happens and the difference between them. The small mouth yawned and the little forked tongue tasted his skin and the sharp tiny teeth did not break him. Somewhere above, the wind turned, bringing with it a breath that had been over the haunted forest, and it came down into the room and touched the eggshells hung from the beam and made them clack together very quietly as if applauding a play that had not yet reached its final act. John sat on the floor and leaned his back against the cold stone again and let the weight of his cloak sit heavy on his legs and the weight of a little head sit in his palm and the weight of the whole of it sit nowhere and everywhere. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, it was because Ghost had lifted his head with purpose and the blue-black had uncurled and the green had flipped itself upright on clumsy legs and the gray had vanished into a gray so complete that even a man who loved it could not immediately find it. The door opened. It did not swing or bang or creep. It opened like a sensible thing obeying a sensible hand. Tormund filled it with his laugh and the woman and the two boys and the girl filled it with their need and Ed filled it with his sigh and Leif filled it with a look at John that said, very plain, so he got to his feet. He had the feeling of standing at the very edge of a map, his boots between the last inked line and white paper, and of knowing that stepping forward was not bravery and not madness but the only honest direction. He stepped. He put his hand to the door and held it and let the cold in and the heat out and the air wrap itself around the small lives and the large ones and the inhuman ones both. Somewhere far away a horn blew one long moan and then another and then another. Somewhere nearer a raven laughed like a nail run along an iron rail. Somewhere inside him a word found where it lived and lay down and was quiet. The wall hummed like a living thing under snow. The dragons breathed. The night waited with all the patience of stone and all the hunger of time. He began to speak, because men needed words even when words were only kindling. He told them what they were going to do. He told them how they were going to do it. He told them, without saying it, that he would stand where he must and that if any man pushed him he would push back and that if any man begged him he would listen and that if any god asked a price he would count his coins in front of it and offer a different number. He told them, with his mouth and his hands and the look he had learned from his father at kitchen doors and the yard steps, that he would not abandon them and that if he did for a heartbeat they had permission to hate him and forgive him in the same breath. Ghost listened. Leif listened. Ed listened and rolled his eyes and went about finding his club. The small blue-black shifted a foot in the straw and lifted its head toward the sound of the horn as if it had known, in the dark under the wall, that it had been born into a world that sang in long harsh notes and had decided to set its own note under them and change them without asking. The green fixed its bright eye on the door and the cold beyond and showed its needle teeth and smiled in the way dragons smile when they are too small to murder their enemies and have to be content with purposes. The gray breathed and became visible again and cocked its head at the man in the doorway holding his laugh like a club and, seeing no reason to pretend humility, blinked as slowly as a king told he may sit.